Okay, hi everybody. I'm trying out a different seating position, so hopefully that will work out okay. So today I want to talk about my stats, my reading stats for 2020. So kind of a wrap up of the year, so to speak, in stat form, because I really love when booktubers do stats. It's always like my favorite videos. So if I'm going to be a booktuber, then I also want to do stats desperately. I read 33 books total this year, which in booktuber terms is not impressive at all, but that's where I'm at, and I'm trying to not let that number hold me back from trying and wanting to be part of this community. 33 books. Keep that in mind as we go through. 13 of those books were Wheel of Time books. That's 39%, so well over a third of the books that I read this year were from the Wheel of Time series. I read the first 12 of the main series as well as the prequel book. So it's a significant portion of the books that I read, which means that some of these stats I'm gonna do like with Wheel of Time and then without Wheel of Time. Okay, if this suddenly looks slightly different, that's because I had to check something on my phone and yeah. So the very first book that I finished this year, that I actually started in 2019, but that I finished this year, was The Ring of Solomon by Jonathan Stroud. The Ring of Solomon is the prequel to the Bartimaeus trilogy. I really like the Bartimaeus trilogy. I read it again last year, and so I started out this year by also reading the prequel, The Ring of Solomon. The last book that I read in 2020, which I just finished yesterday, and I read it all yesterday, was the only book this year that I read in just one day, and that was Bob by Wendy Mass and Rebecca Stead. It's a middle grade fantasy, which I think this book is also, I don't know if it's middle grade, like I think I counted it as middle grade in my stats, but I don't know if it actually is. But I don't know if it seems like right on the edge between like middle grade and YA. So I wasn't really sure. I put it in as middle grade. I don't know. This one I'm 100% sure is middle grade. It's very cute, very sweet book. The book I'm currently reading, which I'm not going to get done before the end of the year because today is the 29th as I'm filming this, and I got stuff going on for New Year's and so I'm definitely not going to get it done. Let's just say that. And that is Towers of Midnight by Robert Jordan and Brandon Sanderson. This is the 13th book in the Wheel of Time series, so the penultimate book, which is very exciting. But in this edition that I have is 1,200 pages long, so it's a big chunker. And I've read about 600 pages, so I'm pretty much exactly halfway through. But I'm definitely not going to have time to read another 600 pages in the 2.5 days that are left of the year. So currently reading, but will not get done by the end of the year. The total number of pages that I read this year, including the 600 pages that I've read in this book, was 18,532. Sounds like a lot, and I'm glad of that. And that's 33 books doesn't sound like a lot, but the books that I read were a lot of them were quite large. But taking that number and dividing it by the number of days that have passed, I read on average 51 pages per day, which is pretty good. I mean, it's not incredibly impressive or anything, but it's it's a pretty stable number, I think. So that feels really good, honestly. It feels really good. The average page count of a book that I read this year was 543. 543 pages per book was my average. So my average book was a tome. I read big books. I read, Wheel of Time, but also a few other bigger books as well. I did do an average page count calculation excluding Wheel of Time, just because I know that all of those are tomes and some of them are really large, like 1,000 pages long. So my average number of pages without Wheel of Time was 380, which I think is a lot more, normal or like average. So 380, I think that sounds pretty reasonable for my non-Wheel of Time books. The shortest book that I finished was this one. It's called Sagan om Alice I Verkligheten, which that's Swedish if you don't recognize it, which translates to The Story of Alice in Reality. It's by Christina, Björk and Inga-Karin Eriksson. So it's a Swedish children's nonfiction about Lewis Carroll, who wrote Alice in Wonderland, as well as the real Alice, who, you know, inspired the story. So I haven't actually ever read Alice in Wonderland, but I read this book so many times growing up. It's gorgeous. It's only 93 pages long, so that's why it's the shortest book I read. But it's got these lovely like illustrations and stuff, like this one. Like, it's gorgeous, honestly, right? It's gorgeous. So I love this book. I reread it over the summer. I mean, I could have read it in one sitting, but I read it over like, I don't know, 3 days or something, just like spacing it out. But a great reread, definitely something that I really enjoyed. The longest book that I read this year was The Gathering Storm by Robert Jordan and Brandon Sanderson. And this is the 12th book in the Wheel of Time. And this edition that I have is 1,070 pages long. I'm pretty sure it's not the longest in like word count out of the books, but in the edition that I've been reading, or the editions that I've been reading, this one is the thickest chunker so far. The one that I'm reading right now, the 13th Wheel of Time book, Towers of Midnight, that one's, you know, 200 pages longer than this almost. So if I'd finished that one would have been by far the longest. But out of the books I finished, The Gathering Storm with 1,070 pages was the longest. Now, hopefully you're gonna be able to see like some kind of graph. I think I'll put it on this side going forward. But I want to talk about my genre breakdown for the year. And the graphs that include all the books that I've read. One book equals 3%. So if you see 3%, then you know that's one book. And you can say that 57.6% of the books that I read this year were fantasy books. And that's a huge majority, or like compared to the other genres, that one really took up like most of the space. And in raw numbers, that's 19 books. So 19 out of the 33 books that I finished this year were fantasy books. And the second largest category with 12%, which is 4 books, so that's 15 less than the largest category, is nonfiction, which I was a little surprised to see, but thinking back, I did read 4 nonfiction books, so I mean, it shouldn't be surprising, right? But I don't know, it was a little surprising. The third category is historical fiction with 9%, so 3 books. Then we have classics and mystery/thriller. I put those in the same category with 6% each, so 2 books each. And then I read 1 book each of contemporary, romance, and sci-fi. So 3% each for those. And then I also made a graph with the genre breakdown excluding the Wheel of Time books, because obviously all of those books are fantasy, just to kind of see what the breakdown would look like without the Wheel of Time books. And you can see that it looks a lot more even, but fantasy is still the largest category. 30% of the non-Wheel of Time books that I read were still fantasy. And then the rest of them were, you know, the same, but the numbers have changed, obviously. Because in this graph, 1 book is 5% instead of 3%. You know, you get it, math. I like to talk about like the number of days it took me to read a book, and it's not impressive. Like, especially if you watch BookTube, I feel like most booktubers finish a book in like 2-3 days or something, which I did not do. My average number of days that it took me to finish a book were 19.9, so almost 20 days to finish a book. So almost 3 weeks. But I do have to say that I did read the complete Fairytales by Brothers Grimm this year. And it's a big book, first of all. It's almost 1,000 pages long. But I didn't like sit down and just like read through this. Like, I didn't sit down and read for like an hour from this book, because they're individual fairy tales. So I would read like 2 or 3 fairy tales a day pretty much, which meant it took a long time for me to get through this. It's like 114 days to get through this. So almost 4 months. I read it I finished it right at the beginning of December, and I started it sometime in the summer. And So this one kind of skews the average a bit. So if I exclude my giant fairy tale book, then the average number of days it took me to read a book drops to 16.8 days. So almost 2.5 weeks, which is still, you know, it's not super impressive. I also calculated it without the Wheel of Time books, mostly just because I was reading them quite slowly in the beginning and they're all really thick books. And so without the Wheel of Time books, my average days taken to read a book was 12.8. So still not a very impressive number, maybe, if you're used to watching BookTube, you know? But it's a lot better than 20 days. Like we're under 2 weeks at least. So that feels good. It feels better. I also made this graph of like the range like of days taken to read. And you can see that the biggest slice is 15 to 21 days, which is 33.3%. So almost a third, 2 to 3 weeks. So 2 to 3 weeks. 25% each, 25 and 25 for 22 to 30 days and 8 to 14 days. So 3 to 4 weeks, or like 3 weeks to a month, and 1 to 2 weeks. So if you add all these together and look at like 1 week to a month, that is like almost all of the books that I read. It's over 80%. So that's definitely my biggest slice. And then I got 6.3% 1 to 3 days, which is 2 books, and 6.3% 4 to 7 days, so 2 books. So I had 4 books total that I finished in 7 or less days. So, you know, not super impressive. And then I have 3.1%, so 1 book that took me over 30 days, less than 60 days, and then 1 book that took me over 60 days to finish, and that was the fairy tale book, which is, you know, it's quite different reading that one to reading most other books, so I don't really mind that. Then my average rating of my books was exactly a 4. It was like 4 point zilch. 4, just 4. Which is great. Like a 4 for me, a 4 means like, I really enjoyed this. Like, that's a 4. I didn't love it, but it wasn't like mediocre or anything. It was just like, this is a very solid, good book. And I know for some people that might mean a 3. They might be like, oh, well, that sounds kind of average. But to me, like average feels different than this was good, you know? So like a 4 is like, this was good. And I think that sums up my reading year pretty well. Like I read like good books. I'm very pleased with that. My star ratings, my breakdown, I had 1, I didn't give any 1 stars. I had 1 book that I gave 2 stars, 5 books that I gave 3 stars, 2 books that I gave 3.5 stars, 15 books that I gave 4 stars, which explains kind of why the average rating is 4, because obviously that was what I mostly gave. I had 4 books that I gave 4.5 stars, and 6 books that I gave 5 stars. And 5 stars for me is like, this is gonna stick with me, I'm gonna remember this. This like hit me somewhere, like I guess those 6 are the favorites of the year, I'd say. Then I want to talk about age category. 3% once again equals 1 book, and you can see that I overwhelmingly read adult books. 78.8% adult. You know, I don't think it's super surprising. I mean, I'm an adult. I know that a lot of adults read YA and that kind of stuff, obviously. Obviously, that's fine. But for me, I feel like as I've become an adult, I've kind of transitioned out of that age range. There are still some YA books that I have on my radar and that I've put on my to-read list and everything. The story is what decides whether or not I pick a book up, not the age range. And I don't know, I guess I'm just more drawn towards like the stories that are presented in adult fiction. I don't know. So we got 78.8% adult, then 15.2% middle grade or children's. I kind of lumped those two together. I don't know if that means different things, but kind of younger than YA, you could call it. And then 6.1%, so 2 books that I classified as YA books. I also did this age category breakdown without the Wheel of Time books because those 13 books are all adult books, obviously. The Wheel of Time is an adult fantasy series. And you can see that still, even without those, the adult books take up the absolute largest slice of the pie. We got 65% adult still. And 25% middle grade children's in this one, because obviously percentages are different, and 10% YA. And also I have to say that I'm a bit unsure about the age categories. There are a few books that I'm like, what is this? Like some books that obviously I know what they are, but as I said, like the Bartimaeus books, The Ring of Solomon that I read this year, I classified this as a middle grade. I don't know, like it's a little hard for me to say, like, is it middle grade? Is it YA? Like even with the original trilogy, I think I definitely classified like the first book in the original trilogy as middle grade, but then the last book, I'm like, is this YA? It's like maybe a good transition from middle grade to YA, maybe. And this one I'm not sure about, because like there are no children in this book. Like the two main characters are one, a demon, who doesn't really have an age, or like he's thousands of years old, and one, a girl who I don't remember exactly how old she is, but she's definitely not a child. She might be like in her late teens. So it feels weird to put this as middle grade, but I don't know. When I tried to look up what it was, it felt like it was marketed as like a children's story, like for like 11-year-olds or something, or at least the original trilogy. I don't know if the prequel is marketed differently. I don't know. So I'm a little bit unsure. And the books that I did put as YA, the only two books that I did, are the two Wayward Children books that I read this year. I read the two first books, Every Heart a Doorway and Down Among the Sticks and Bones by Seanan McGuire. Those are the two that I put as YA. And I'm not sure if they actually are YA. It's a little hard to tell. I mean, the characters are at like a YA age. They're like 16, 17-ish. And it's like youthful, but then there's also some stuff in it that's like super dark, especially in the first book, I think. But I mean, YA can be dark, so I'm like, I don't know. I put those as YA, I think that's right, but I'm not 100% sure. Then I looked at publishing year, and the earliest published book is either The Complete Fairytales by Brothers Grimm, which this one's hard because this is a complete edition, right? And so it's got like all of their fairy tales, and they were not all published in the same year. So they're all published in the 1800s, but definitely in different years in the 1800s. So it's a little hard to say that this would be the earliest published. Disregarding that one, the earliest published would be Wuthering Heights by Emily Bronte, which is published in 1847. It would be the earliest published book that I read. The latest published book, being published in 2019, because I didn't read a single 2020 release this year. I'm just such a backlist reader because I feel so behind. The latest published book from 2019, which was also the only 2019 release that I read, so I'm not even up to last year. That was Daisy Jones and the Six by Taylor Jenkins Reid. Latest published, 2019. I did a graph for the time period breakdown, and you can see that the largest slice with 36.4% is the 2010s, so more, recent books. And following that with 30.3% are the 1990s, and then 18.2% the 2000s. So the 90s forward are definitely the biggest, the by far biggest slice that I have, which, I guess that makes sense. That's the time period I'm living in, right? Then I had 6.1%, so two books, the 1800s, which would be, the Bronte Wuthering Heights book and the Fairytales. And then 3%, so which is one book, 1930s, 3% 1940s, and 3% 1980s. I also did this breakdown without the Wheel of Time books because all the Wheel of Time books that I've finished were published, most of them were published in the 90s, and some of them were published in the 2000s. The last two books, I believe, were published in the 2010s, but I haven't finished those yet, so they're not in there. So that breakdown, you can see, is very skewed towards the 2010s. My non-Wheel of Time books, I definitely focused on newer stuff. And in this one, 5% equals one book. So 60% 2010s, which is 12 books. and then 10% each in the 1800s and the 1990s, so 2 books each, and then 1 book each, 5%, 30s, 40s, 80s, and 2000s. So I feel like the 2000s and the 1990s pies, they just died without the Wheel of Time books. That was just like mostly all Wheel of Time. And then series versus standalone. I read 60.6% series. That is 20 books. So 20 out of the 33 books that I finished this year were part of series. And 39.4% were standalones. Now, obviously, all of the 13 Wheel of Time books that I read are part of series, or a series, obviously, the Wheel of Time series. So I also looked at this without the Wheel of Time, just to see like what other books did I pick up, because the Wheel of Time was really like my main project of this year, and I'm not quite done, but I'll be done with that project at the start of 2021. So the other books that I picked up were 65% standalones and 35% series. So I didn't completely shy away from series outside of the Wheel of Time, but I didn't completely, dive headfirst into a bunch of other series because, the Wheel of Time was taking up a lot of my time. And okay, gender of author I also looked at, and I got 57.6% male and 42.4% female. So that's a fairly even breakdown. It's a little skewed towards the men, but it's still fairly even. That's not something that I pay a lot of attention to. It's just, interesting to see where you end up. Now, obviously, all the Wheel of Time books, again, were written originally by a man, Robert Jordan, and then after he passed, the last 3 books, of which I only had time to read one, were finished by Brandon Sanderson, another man. So, removing the Wheel of Time books, you definitely get a very female-skewed graph. Without the Wheel of Time books, I read 70% books by female authors and 30% books by male authors. And that's not something that I consciously did or anything, but I don't know. I guess I was just more drawn to books written by women. I don't know why. Now, I also wanted to look at like the Goodreads stats for my books, like how many people rated them and like what they rated them, just to kind of get a feel for like how many other people are reading these books and like how much do they like them. And the average rating on Goodreads for the books that I read this year was 4.08, which is pretty close to my rating because my average rating was a 4.00. And so it's pretty close, but theirs is a little bit higher. But, an average rating over 4, I feel like that's good. Like, people like these books. I definitely read well-liked books this year. I wanted to look at, like, what book I read was the closest to that average rating, like, what book is the most representative of how much people like the books that I read this year. And that ended up being Gone Girl by Gillian, or is it Gillian? People say it differently. I think it's Gillian. Gillian Flynn. This one, when I looked, at least had pretty much exactly a 4.08 rating. So apparently people like the books that I read this year as much as they like Gone Girl. The highest rated book that I read this year was The Gathering Storm by Robert Jordan and Brandon Sanderson, which is the 12th book in the Wheel of Time. And this has a 4.36 rating on Goodreads, which is high. Like, that's very good. Like, obviously people like this, but I've definitely seen a lot higher. I feel like the craziest high ratings that you see are like over 4.5, like 4.6 even. You're like, wow, shit, people love this. People don't love this quite that much, but it's definitely well-liked, I'd say that. It was a great experience. Book 11 and book 12 are my 2 favorites on the Wheel of Time so far. I'm working my way through book 13 right now, so we'll see how I feel when that one ends. Lowest rated with a rating of 3.66 was The New Silk Roads by Peter Frankopan. This is like a history, economy, politics nonfiction. And I was intrigued. It's like about the importance of like China and Russia and the Middle East and like everything that's happening there in our part of the world. We're really focused on like Europe and the US and like what's happening over here. But there's so much happening in like China, Middle East, Russia, like those kind of places. So I was really intrigued to read this to just like get a different perspective, but I'm not super surprised that it's the lowest rated, even though a 3.66, that's not bad. Like, I feel like if you hit like a 3.5 or above, then it's still like a liked book. I wouldn't call it like disliked with a 3.66, but I'm not super surprised that it's not loved. Let's say that. Now, I also wanted to look at the number of ratings that a book has, because that kind of gives a feel for like how many people weighed in, you know, like how many people have read this, how many people have had an official opinion, let's say, on this book. And the average number of ratings for a book that I read this year was 239,000, which is high, right? Like, I don't really know like what the average number of ratings a book has on Goodreads generally. Like, I don't have those numbers, but I feel like over 200,000, that's a lot. So I definitely read books that are well known this year. And the closest one to that number that I read was, I don't have it with me, so I'll put a picture, is The Great Hunt by Robert Jordan. And that is the second book in the Wheel of Time. So that early on in the series, there's still quite a lot of people reading, and you know, so that's not super surprising. I did also look at the median number of ratings, because average, I feel like I had a few that were really high, so they were probably skewing the average quite a bit. So I also looked at the median, which was 109,000, which is a lot less than the average, but it's still high. I feel like over 100,000, that's still a lot of ratings. It's still something that a lot of people have read, because, you know, a lot of people obviously don't rate it on Goodreads. And the book that best hit that was The Path of Daggers by Robert Jordan. So another Wheel of Time book. Obviously, the Wheel of Time books took up a lot of space on my, you know, reading shelves this year. So this one is the eighth book in the Wheel of Time. So obviously a lot of people have maybe not gotten quite this far, but Wheel of Time. Now, the least rated book that I read, that had the fewest number of ratings, when I looked, it only had like 30 ratings, which is very, very low. Obviously, that's like no one's, I mean, people have read it, but like no one's rated it on Goodreads, and that I don't have it with me, but it's Hjältar och monster på Himlavalvet by Samzelius, and that title translates into Heroes and Monsters of the Heavens, and it's a like children's version of the Greek myths. Not really retellings, just kind of tellings, like but for children, of the Greek myths, or like some of the key Greek myths like Hercules, etc. It was published in the 80s, and it's a Swedish book. It was something that I was really raised on. Like I wasn't born until like 15 years after it came out, but it was a big part of my growing up, and so I reread it, or maybe I read it for the first time. I'm not sure if I'd ever read the whole thing before, over the summer. It was a great experience, but and I loved it, but I'm not surprised that it doesn't have a lot of ratings. Like the majority of people on Goodreads obviously can't read Swedish, so they're not going to be rating that book. Now, the most rated book that I read with 2.3 million ratings when I looked was Gone Girl by Gillian Flynn. And that's not surprising. Obviously, it's a huge hit, and it was made into a movie that was a big hit. You know, it's been super talked about, you know, since it came out pretty much. I'm not surprised that this is the highest rated, but 2.3 million, that is a lot of ratings. That is a shit ton of people who have read this and rated it. So good for her. I liked it. Now, the last stat that I have is reread ? And you can see that 75.8% of the books that I read this year were not rereads. I have been kind of a chronic rereader for the last quite a few years until last year, which has led me to become incredibly behind on anything that I hadn't read before. Like, it doesn't even have to be like a new release. I've just only reread pretty much, and that's fine. Like, rereading's fine. You know, I'm a rereader. I'm never gonna completely stop rereading. I was really, like, if I'd done this like 3-4 years ago or something, it would have been like 100% rereads. It would have been like one book that was new. And that's not what I want. So I really made an effort this year to like not really like spend that much time rereading. And so 75.8% no, 21.2% yes. Several of the kind of children's books that I read were rereads. They didn't take that much time, and it was like a really nostalgic thing. I was rereading stuff that like really meant something, or something that I like completely forgotten, and that I want to like continue with the series or something. So I was rereading with a purpose in a way that I haven't really done previously. But still 21.2% rereads, which is 7 books. And I have one that's not sure. 3%, one book, not sure. And that's, once again, The Ring of Solomon, the prequel to the Bartimaeus trilogy. Because I know that I've read the Bartimaeus trilogy previously, but I'm not sure if I ever continued on to the prequel. I wasn't really remembering stuff when I was reading it, but I might have read it once, you know, a long time ago, and just not really remember. I'm not entirely sure, so I didn't want to count it as a yes, but I didn't want to count it as a no, so I put it in its own little category. 4 books that were not Wheel of Time that I reread, because I had to reread the first 3 books of the Wheel of Time to be able to continue on, which I then obviously did. And so those 4, that's 2 childhood favorites, 1 book that I didn't remember at all, that I had to reread to be able to continue on with the series, which I want to do, and then 1 book that's just, I love, no regrets there. So those were all the stats. That took way longer than I kind of expected.